a promise to the children of the frontier, a solemn promise that turned to dust in her mouth. You see, when the silver vein in Redemption Gulch finally gave out, so did the decency of the men who worked it. And the schoolmarm, a woman named Evelyn Reed, was left with a choice. A brutal choice that every forgotten soul in the West eventually had to face. Perish where you stand, or risk everything on the horizon. She chose the horizon. This is the story of her 100-mile walk through the unforgiving heart of the Arizona Territory. A desperate pilgrimage with nothing but grit and memory to fuel it. It's a story of how, at the very edge of death, she was found by a man as harsh and mysterious as the land itself. A wealthy rancher of Apache blood who would either be her salvation or her final, most devastating lesson. The sun was a hammer. The Arizona Territory was its anvil. And for 4 days, Evelyn Reed had been stretched across it. For 4 days, she felt it beat down on her, forging her eastern resolve into a brittle, cracking thing. The town of Sanctuary, a name that once sounded like a prayer, was still just a phantom somewhere beyond the shimmering heat. They told her it was 60 miles away. 60 miles to add to the 40 she had already walked. 100 miles on a fool's hope in a pair of ruined leather shoes. Her journey started in a ghost town. It wasn't a ghost town yet, but it was dying. Its name was Redemption Gulch, a place of loud, muddy promises carved out of the red earth by the sheer force of a silver strike. Evelyn had come from Philadelphia a year before that. Her trunk held more books than dresses, and her heart was full of a righteous, educated fire to bring literacy to the wild frontier. And for a time it was glorious. The one-room schoolhouse, a building she'd helped raise with her own two hands, echoed with the clumsy recitations of miners' children. She taught them sums and letters, and they in turn taught her the quiet resilience of people who lived their entire lives on the knife's edge of fortune. The man who owned that knife was Bartholomew Kane. He wasn't the mayor. He wasn't the sheriff. His power was more fundamental than that. He owned the mining company that was the town's heart. He owned the general store that was its stomach. He owned the saloon that was its pickled liver. And in owning all that, he owned the town. Kane was a man made of hard angles and quiet menace, with eyes the color of a winter sky that missed absolutely nothing. He had tolerated Evelyn's little school, seeing it as a quaint necessity. A little something to keep the miners' wives from complaining too much. He'd even tossed a few dollars her way for a new blackboard. But it wasn't charity. It was a king tossing a coin to a court jester. Then the silver began to disappear. The town's heart began to wither. The daily yields got smaller, the miners' faces grew longer, and the whole mood in the gulch curdled from hopeful to sour. Fights in the saloon became a nightly thing. The credit at Kane's store was cut off without a word of warning. Desperation began to stink in the air, thick and cheap like bad whiskey. Evelyn's salary, paid by a small community fund, was the first thing to vanish. But she kept teaching. She took her payment in potatoes and mended clothes, and sometimes in just a grateful nod from a tired mother. She believed in the promise she'd made to those children. But Bartholomew Kane didn't see virtue. He saw a challenge to his unraveling authority. A town that was no longer making him money was a town that no longer needed civilizing. It needed to be bled dry. The end came as fast as a flash flood. One evening, she was sweeping the dusty floor of the schoolhouse. The door flew open and Deputy Finch stormed in. He was a man whose loyalty to the law was a poor second to his loyalty to Kane's payroll. He accused her of stealing supplies from the general store, a side of bacon, a sack of flour, and a bottle of laudanum. It was a ridiculous lie. She had an open line of credit, one she hadn't even used in a month. She was patching her own clothes and living on the humble gifts from her students' families. "Mr. Kane has the receipts," Finch sneered, his tobacco-stained teeth glinting in the lantern light. "Your signature. Plain as day." She knew right then it was a forgery, a cruel and efficient way to get rid of her. To fight it meant standing against Kane himself. And in Redemption Gulch, that was just a slower form of suicide. Kane wanted her gone. He wanted every mouth he no longer had a use for to simply vanish. He was dismantling his own little kingdom, piece by piece, and she was just a piece of unwanted furniture. She was given a choice. Face the circuit judge, a man known to keep his wallet in Kane's back pocket or be gone by sunrise. So she left. She walked out of the sleeping town with a small satchel. In it was a spare blouse, her father's worn copy of Shakespeare, a half-empty canteen, and a small pouch of hardtack. She didn't look back. Looking back meant admitting her dream was dead, and she couldn't bear that. Not yet. The first day on the trail was fueled by pure indignation, the second by a grim determination. By the third day, her body began to betray her. The alkali dust coated her tongue and throat, turning every swallow into an agony of sandpaper and grit. The sun blistered the back of her neck. Her shoes, sturdy enough for the cobblestones of Philadelphia, were being systematically shredded by the sharp rocks of the unforgiving terrain. The landscape was a monster, a beautiful, terrible monster. Towering saguaros stood like silent, judgmental sentinels. Distant mesas burned purple and orange at sunset, but its beauty was a lie, a painted veil hiding a core of pure, unadulterated hostility. Now, on the fourth day, there was nothing left. Nothing but a raw animal instinct to put one foot in front of the other. The anger was gone, burned away by the relentless heat. Her hope had evaporated yesterday, just like the last drops in her canteen. All that remained was the rhythmic crunch of her ruined shoes on the gravel and the screaming choir of memories in her head. She saw the faces of her students, young William with his missing front tooth, little Sarah who could already write her own name. The memories were a torment, a vision of a life that had been stolen from her. Her vision began to swim. The horizon blurred into a watery line. The saguaros started wavering like figures in a funhouse mirror. She stumbled, her ankle twisting violently on a loose rock. A thin, reedy cry of pain was stolen by the wind before it even left her lips. She pushed herself back up, leaning heavily on a sun-bleached rock. Her dress, a sensible gray wool garment, was torn at the hem and stained with sweat and grime. She was no longer Miss Evelyn Reed, the educated schoolmarm. She was just a desperate creature, being hunted by the land itself. She took one step, then another, then a third, and then her legs gave out completely. The world didn't go black. It did something far worse. It turned a blinding, painful, merciless white. The ground rushed up to meet her, the sharp gravel pressing into her cheek like a cruel kiss goodbye. Her last coherent thought wasn't of the town of Sanctuary or of her stolen life, but of the profound, crushing irony of it all. She had come west to bring light into the darkness, and now she was dying alone, bleached by a merciless sun in a land that did not care. The dust settled around her, a patient, final shroud. The first sensation was water, not a gulp or a drink, but a cool, damp cloth on her forehead, chasing away the feverish heat that had boiled her thoughts. It was a miracle. The second sensation was the feeling of being lifted. Strong arms, impossibly strong arms, scooped her from the searing ground as if she weighed nothing. There was a scent of horse leather, dust, and something else, the clean, earthy smell of sagebrush. A voice spoke. It was low and resonant, but the words were lost to her, meaningless sounds in the roaring static of her consciousness. She was adrift, a piece of flotsam on a dark, merciful current that was pulling her away from the white-hot shore of death. When she woke up for real, it was to stillness and shadow. She was lying on a real bed with clean, coarse sponge sheets that felt like pure silk against her sun-scorched skin. The room was cool. The oppressive heat was held at bay by thick adobe walls. A single, unadorned window was cut into one wall, revealing a slice of deep indigo sky, pricked with the first few evening stars. This was not a miner's shack. This was no traveler's lean-to. The very air itself felt different, solid, permanent. Evelyn tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness sent her slumping back against a surprisingly soft pillow. Her throat felt raw, but the agonizing sandpaper rasp was gone. A cup of water sat on a simple wooden nightstand beside the bed. She reached for it with a trembling hand, drinking greedily, the cool liquid a balm to her parched insides. The door creaked open. A man stepped into the room, silhouetted against the lamplight from the outer hall. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and he moved with a quiet confidence that seemed to absorb the silence rather than break it. As he moved closer, into the faint starlight from the window, his features slowly came into focus. He had a face that looked as if it had been carved from the same red rock as the canyons, all sharp planes and stark lines. His hair was black as a raven's wing, thick and tied back at the nape of his neck. But it was his eyes that held her. They were dark and intelligent, watchful, and utterly, completely unreadable. He was not a white man. That much was clear. His skin was the color of rich copper. His heritage was etched into the high cheekbones and the proud, stern set of his jaw. "You are awake," he said. His voice was the same low, resonant one she'd heard in her delirium. It held no discernible accent, just a careful, precise diction, as if he weighed each word on a scale before speaking it. "Where, where am I?" Evelyn whispered, her own voice a fragile, unfamiliar croak. "Coyote Springs Ranch," he answered. "My land." He stepped forward and lit a lamp on the nightstand. The warm yellow glow filled the room, revealing its Spartan but well-crafted nature. A heavy wooden wardrobe stood against one wall, a simple writing desk against another. There were no frivolous decorations, only things of quality and purpose. "You were a mile from the northern spring," he continued, his gaze assessing her without a hint of pity or curiosity. He was simply stating a fact. "Another few hours and the buzzards would have been feasting. You were lucky." Evelyn flinched at the brutal bluntness of his words. "I... thank you." The words felt small, hopelessly inadequate. "You saved my life." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "I found you. The desert is a harsh judge. It does not care for intentions." He pulled a chair from the desk and sat, the wood groaning under his weight. "I am Nathaniel Blackwood." The name meant nothing to her, but the way he said it, with that simple, final statement of fact, implied that it should. "Evelyn Reed." "Miss Evelyn Reed," he corrected softly, his eyes flicking to the worn but respectable cut of her dress, which now lay cleaned and neatly folded on a nearby chest. "You are a long way from anywhere dressed like that. You are not from Sanctuary." It wasn't a question. "No," she said. "I was traveling there. From Redemption Gulch." A flicker of something, interest maybe, crossed Nathaniel's stoic face. "Redemption Gulch is a dead town. The silver is gone. The rats are fleeing the sinking ship." "I was not fleeing," Evelyn said, a spark of her old pride returning, surprising her. "I was forced out." Nathaniel just watched her, his expression unchanging. He seemed to possess a stillness that was deeply unnerving, a patience that felt ancient and absolute. He was waiting for her to continue, but she knew he would not press her. He would simply wait. Just then, the door opened again, and an older man entered. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, and his body was stooped but wiry. He carried a tray with a bowl of steaming broth. "Boss," the man said, his voice a gravelly drawl. "Figured she might be up. Smell of this would wake the dead." He set the tray on her lap. He was a white man, with pale blue eyes that held a surprising, disarming kindness. "Name's Gus. I'm the foreman around here. You eat that slow now, miss. Your stomach ain't ready for a steak just yet." "Thank you, Gus," Evelyn murmured. The savory scent of the broth was making her stomach ache, with a hunger so deep it was almost painful. Gus nodded at Nathaniel. "Doc should be here by morning. Sent young Thomas out as soon as we got her back." He looked back at Evelyn, a hint of awe in his eyes. "You gave us a real scare, miss. Don't see many folks walk out of the salt flats alive." Nathaniel stood up. "Rest, Miss Reed. We will speak more tomorrow." He turned and walked out. Gus followed, pulling the door almost closed, leaving just a sliver of lamplight from the hall. Left alone, Evelyn held the warm bowl in her hands, the heat seeping into her chilled skin. She was safe. She was alive. But she had traded one form of terrifying uncertainty for another. She had been rescued from the desert, only to find herself in the house of a man who seemed as remote and untamed as the land he ruled. An Apache, she presumed from his features. Yet he spoke perfect, unaccented English, and his name was Nathaniel Blackwood. He owned this ranch, this place of obvious substance and order, and he commanded men like Gus. He was a paradox, a puzzle she lacked the strength to even begin to solve. She took a slow, careful spoonful of the broth. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted in her life. As the warmth spread through her, a chilling realization settled in her gut. Her ordeal wasn't over. It had simply entered a new and far more complicated chapter. The next few days passed in a strange haze of healing and quiet observation. The doctor from Sanctuary, a portly man named Peterson, with sweat-stained collars and surprisingly gentle hands, came and went. He pronounced her severely dehydrated and malnourished, but otherwise sound. He treated the blistering burns on her neck and face with a soothing, greasy salve and prescribed rest and plenty of food. Coyote Springs Ranch provided both in abundance. The food was simple but plentiful: hearty stews, fresh bread, baked daily, eggs, and strong black coffee. The rest was enforced by the profound, deep quiet of the place. The ranch was an oasis, an impossible splash of green nestled in a wide valley. It seemed to defy the very nature of the surrounding arid landscape. The main house, she soon learned, was the heart of a sprawling, efficient operation. From her window, she could see corrals, a large barn, and several smaller adobe buildings where the ranch hands lived. The entire settlement was cradled by a crescent of low, rocky mesas that kept the harshest winds at bay, like a cupped hand protecting a candle flame. Her host, Nathaniel Blackwood, remained a distant, enigmatic figure. He would appear at breakfast and dinner, sitting at the head of a long, heavy wooden table in the main room. He ate mostly in silence, his attention seemingly fixed on his plate, yet Evelyn felt his awareness of everything in the room. The clink of a fork, a muttered conversation between two ranch hands, her own hesitant movements. He was a silent king in his court. He was, as she had suspected, of Apache lineage. Gus, in one of his rare talkative moods, had supplied a few spare details. Nathaniel's mother had been Apache. His father, a white trader who had died when Nathaniel was just a boy. Nate, Gus had said, leaning against the porch railing while she took her first few shaky steps outside. He sees the world from both sides of the fence and trusts neither one of them fully. He bought this land years ago, knew where the water was. People called him a fool for buying up a pile of rocks. Gus had paused, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. But the water, miss, the water is everything out here. He ain't just rich in cattle, he's rich in water. This information only deepened the mystery. He was a man of two worlds, yet he seemed to belong wholly to this one, the one he had built himself. His house was a perfect reflection of this strange duality. The structure was adobe, native to the land, but inside, alongside the woven Navajo blankets and simple clay pottery, was a massive bookshelf. It was filled with leather-bound volumes, Dickens, Plato, texts on engineering and geology. He was clearly an educated man, a self-educated one. It was a library that would have been the envy of any scholar back in Philadelphia. On the fourth morning, feeling stronger, Evelyn rose early. She dressed in her own clothes, which had been cleaned and mended for her, and found Nathaniel on the porch. He was staring out at the rising sun as it painted the eastern mesas in hues of rose and gold. He held a mug of coffee in his hands. "Good morning, Miss Reed," he said without turning. "You are healing well." "Thanks to your hospitality, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, stepping to the railing beside him. The morning air was crisp and clean. I I don't know how I can ever repay you." He finally turned to look at her. His dark eyes seemed to pierce right through the polite facade she was trying to maintain. "Repayment is a concept for merchants. I found a person in need of help. I helped." "Still," she insisted, "I am in your debt." "Then consider it paid by answering a question," he said, his tone shifting, becoming more focused. "You said you were forced from Redemption Gulch. Who forced you?" Evelyn hesitated, the memory of Deputy Finch's sneering face and the cold finality of Kane's decision rising in her mind. "The man who runs the town. His name is Bartholomew Kane." Nathaniel's expression remained impassive, but she saw a muscle tighten in his jaw. "Kane. I know the name. He picked the bones of the Silver Strike clean. What was his grievance with a school teacher?" So she told him. The words tumbled out in a rush of renewed indignation. She told him about the false accusation, the fabricated receipt, the impossible choice between a rigged trial and exile. She expected sympathy, perhaps even a flicker of outrage. Instead, Nathaniel simply nodded, his gaze returning to the horizon. "He saw you as a liability," Nathaniel stated, his voice flat and analytical. "A symbol of a community he no longer had an interest in maintaining. An orderly man, Kane. He likes to tie up loose ends." His dispassionate analysis was jarring. "It was unjust," she declared, her voice rising with frustration. "He destroyed my livelihood. He lied. He threatened me." "He survived," Nathaniel countered, his voice unchanged. "The West doesn't reward justice, Miss Reed. It rewards strength and foresight. Kane was strong enough to take what he wanted from the Gulch, and he had the foresight to know when to abandon it. Your Eastern ideals of fairness are a luxury this land does not afford." His words stung like a slap, dismissing her entire worldview as a naive, childish indulgence. "And what do you believe in, Mr. Blackwood?" she shot back. "Survival at any cost? Is there no room for decency, for education, for building something that lasts beyond one man's greed?" A faint, mirthless smile touched his lips. "I believe in this," he said, gesturing with his mug to the sprawling ranch, the green fields, the distant herds of cattle. "I believe in what I can build and what I can protect. I believe in water, soil, and a strong fence. Decency is the law you write for yourself inside that fence. Education is learning the difference between a rattlesnake and a bull snake. Everything else," he said, his eyes meeting hers, "is conversation for Eastern parlors." They stood in a tense, crackling silence. A chasm of philosophy had opened between them. Evelyn felt a familiar frustration bubble up inside her. He was like so many men she'd met in the West. Cynical, hardened, seeing the world only in terms of power and property. Yet he was different. He hadn't just conquered a piece of the wilderness, he understood it. And he had saved her life without a moment's hesitation. He was a walking contradiction. To break the tension, she changed the subject. "I saw your library. It's extensive." "A man who doesn't read is blind in one eye," he said simply. "I am a teacher," she said, finding her footing on more familiar ground. "Or I was. I brought books with me. I believe education is the foundation of any true community. A community of children who can quote Shakespeare, but can't find water in a dry wash is a community that will not last a season," he retorted, his voice sharp. "And a community that can find water but has no soul, no understanding of the world beyond its own borders," she fired back. "Is that a community worth saving?" For the first time since she had met him, Nathaniel Blackwood looked at her with genuine, undisguised interest. He studied her face, the defiant tilt of her chin, the fire in her eyes. The corner of his mouth twitched again, but this time it seemed less cynical, more intrigued. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "you have a point, Miss Reed." He drained his coffee mug. "Gus tells me some of the hands have children. They run wild for the most part. If you are feeling strong enough and find yourself bored of your own company, perhaps you can show me what your kind of education is worth." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an agreement. It was a challenge. And as Evelyn watched him stride away towards the corrals, his tall frame cutting a sharp silhouette against the brilliant morning sun, she felt a flicker of the purpose she thought she had lost forever in the dust of the trail. This haven was uneasy, and its master was infuriating. But for the first time in a long, long time, she felt she had something to prove. True to his word, Nathaniel arranged it. An old storeroom behind the main house was cleared out. 2 long benches and a makeshift table were hauled in. Gus, with a twinkle in his eye, found a large, smooth piece of slate that, when propped against the wall, made a serviceable blackboard. Within a single day, Evelyn Reed had a schoolhouse again. Her students were a wild, unkempt bunch. There were 5 of them, ranging in age from 6 to 12, the children of the permanent ranch hands who lived and worked year-round at Coyote Springs. They were shy and suspicious at first, their hands more comfortable with ropes and rocks than with the clumsy pieces of chalk she gave them. Their knowledge was of the land. They could identify a hawk's cry from a mile away. They knew which berries were poison, and they could track a lizard across a rocky outcrop. Of letters and numbers, they knew almost nothing. Evelyn threw herself into the work with a passion that surprised even herself. She was patient, coaxing the letters of the alphabet from them, teaching them to write their own names in the dust with a stick before they ever moved on to the precious slate. She didn't talk to them of faraway cities or forgotten kings and queens. She rooted their lessons in their own world. They counted the cattle in the nearby corral. They learned the letters that spelled water and horse. She read them simple stories about the sun and the stars they already knew so well. Nathaniel never once visited the school, but she knew he was watching. Sometimes she would glance up from a lesson and see him standing by the far corral, observing for a moment before turning back to his work. He never offered a word of praise, nor a word of criticism. His silence was a neutral canvas on which she could paint her own success or failure. But she did notice that extra supplies, paper, pencils, and a few tattered primers, appeared on her desk one morning, left there without comment. Her presence on the ranch began to soften the hard edges of its daily life. The gruff ranch hands, who had initially eyed her with deep suspicion, began to tip their hats and offer gruff, good mornings. The cook started saving her the best cut of bread at dinner. She was no longer just the stray Nathaniel had dragged in from the desert. She was the teacher. She had found a small pocket of purpose in this strange, isolated kingdom. And then the outside world came crashing in. It happened 2 weeks into her tenure. A rider approached the ranch, not one of the regular hands, but a stranger, a man wearing the tarnished badge of a deputy. It was Finch. His face was somehow more weaselly and unpleasant than she remembered. He rode straight to the main house, his posture arrogant, as if he expected to be received like a visiting dignitary. Evelyn was outside with the children, watching them practice their letters in the dirt when he arrived. Her heart leaped into her throat. A primal fear seized her, and she instinctively herded the children behind her. Nathaniel emerged from the house to meet him. He moved with that same unhurried, deliberate grace she'd come to recognize. He stopped at the edge of the porch, not inviting the deputy up, creating an immediate boundary. "This is private property, deputy," Nathaniel said, his voice level and cold as a riverstone. "Just doing my duty, Blackwood," Finch sneered, not dismounting. "Got a warrant here from the circuit judge for the arrest of one Evelyn Reed, wanted for theft back in Redemption Gulch." He held up a piece of paper, waving it like a flag of conquest. Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. Cain. He wouldn't let it go. He was reaching for her, even here, in this fortress of solitude. Nathaniel didn't even glance at the paper. "That warrant is for a jurisdiction that ends 10 miles east of here. This is my land. Your piece of paper is worthless." "Now see here," Finch blustered, his hand dropping instinctively to the butt of his pistol. "That's interfering with the law." "The only law that matters on Coyote Springs is mine," Nathaniel said. The quiet deadliness in his voice made the air grow still. He hadn't moved a muscle, yet he seemed to have grown larger, more menacing. As if from nowhere, Gus and two other ranch hands had appeared. They held rifles with a casualness that was far more threatening than any open display of aggression. Finch's bravado evaporated like a puddle in the noon sun. He looked from Nathaniel's unblinking stare to the armed men flanking him, his face paling. He was a bully, and he had just run up against a wall he couldn't break. "Cain wants to see her," Finch said, his voice losing its swagger, becoming a whine. "He just wants to talk. If Bartholomew Cain wants to speak with anyone on my ranch, he can ask for permission to approach, and he will be denied," Nathaniel said. "Now get off my land before you find yourself buried in it." The threat was so plainly stated, so devoid of emotion, that it was utterly, terrifyingly believable. Finch swallowed hard, his eyes darting around nervously. Without another word, he yanked his horse's reins, turned, and galloped away, kicking up a plume of indignant dust. The children were silent, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. Evelyn's legs felt weak with relief. She walked over to Nathaniel, who was still watching the retreating rider. "He won't stop," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Cain, he's not a man who likes being told no." "I am aware of that," Nathaniel said, his gaze distant. "Why?" she asked, a knot of confusion tightening in her chest. "Why would he send a man all this way for a simple teacher he wanted to be rid of? It doesn't make any sense." Nathaniel finally turned to her, his dark eyes meeting hers. The unreadable expression was gone, replaced by something grim and deadly serious. Because it was never about you, Miss Reed, he said softly. Not really. He looked past her, towards the impossible green of the valley, the source of all his wealth and power. You didn't just run from Kane's ghost town, he continued, his voice low and intense. You ran straight into the heart of his next ambition. He doesn't want you. He wants to know what you're doing here. He wants to know what you might have told me. Told you about what? Evelyn asked, completely bewildered. I have nothing to tell. I know nothing of his plans. You know that his town is dead, Nathaniel said. You are a living witness to the fact that the silver is gone. And you are now living on the only piece of land in this entire territory that matters more than a mountain of silver. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle on her like a physical blow. He isn't interested in the past, Miss Reed. He's interested in the future. And the future of this territory will be decided by one thing and one thing only. He pointed towards the lush green pastures, the lifeblood of his kingdom. Water. The word hung in the air between them. Water. It was no longer a simple word for sustenance. It was a declaration of war. It was the lifeblood of Coyote Springs, the secret to its impossible greenness in a brown dying land. Evelyn looked from Nathaniel's grim face to the verdant valley, and a terrible, chilling understanding began to dawn. Come, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. It is time you understood what this fight is truly about. He led her not on horseback, but on foot, away from the bustling heart of the ranch and up a winding, rocky path that climbed the side of the western mesa. Gus joined them, his rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm, his weathered face set in grim, unsmiling lines. The climb was strenuous, and by the time they reached a high ledge overlooking the entire valley, Evelyn was breathing heavily. But the view stole what breath she had left. From this vantage point, she could see the secret of Coyote Springs laid bare. The ranch wasn't just situated in a valley, it was situated at the mouth of a narrow canyon, carved deep into the mesa itself over thousands of years. And from the dark shadows of that canyon, a stream emerged. Not a trickle, but a steady, robust flow of clear, life-giving water. It was this stream that fed the pastures, that filled the troughs, that made life in this arid land not just possible, but prosperous. It was the ranch's heart, pumping life into every corner of the valley. This is Coyote Springs, Nathaniel said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to merge with the landscape. There are two others, smaller, on the northern edge of my property. But this is the main artery. It's fed by a deep aquifer, an underground river that has run for 1,000 years. It's beautiful, Evelyn breathed, mesmerized by the sight. It is power, he corrected her softly, his voice hard. Kane's silver mine required tons of water to operate. He pumped the Red Creek dry to get at his precious ore. Now the creek is gone, the silver is gone, and the land for 50 miles around Redemption Gulch is dying of thirst. Gus spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the rocks below. Kane ain't no fool. He knows the next fortune in this territory won't be dug out of the ground. It'll be sold by the barrel. Nathaniel pointed to the east in the direction of the dying town she had fled. Kane has been buying up the deeds to failed homesteads between here and there. Land that is worthless, dirt and rock, without water. At the same time, he's been petitioning the territorial government, claiming this entire region needs a proper irrigation system to encourage settlement, to bring progress. The pieces began to click into place in Evelyn's mind, forming a picture of cold, calculating, breathtaking ambition. He wants your water, she said, looking at Nathaniel, the horror of it dawning on her. He wants to control it, Nathaniel clarified, his voice laced with a bitter edge. He plans to build a dam at the mouth of this canyon. He'll create a reservoir and sell the water rights to the very same settlers he'll lure here with government grants. He will be the king of this entire valley, more powerful than any silver baron ever was. But this is your land, Evelyn protested, the injustice of it making her blood boil. He can't just take it. He won't take it, Miss Reed. He'll have it given to him, Nathaniel said. He will go to the capital and paint me as a greedy half-breed, hoarding a natural resource that should belong to the people. He will tell the government that I am an obstacle to progress, to manifest destiny. He will use the law, twisting it to his purpose, and men like Deputy Finch will be his instruments. Suddenly, Kane's relentless pursuit of her made a chilling kind of sense. He sent Finch here to arrest me, she realized aloud, her voice trembling. Not because he cared about the theft charge, but to test you, to see how you would react, to establish a legal precedent for entering your land. Precisely, Nathaniel affirmed, and perhaps to see if you had told me anything, if you had overheard any of his plans while you were still in the gulch. A cold dread washed over her. She had thought she was fleeing a petty tyrant in a dying town. She now understood she had stumbled, blind and desperate, into the opening moves of a war. A war with this ranch, this valley, this man, at its very center. Her small personal injustice was merely a pawn in a much larger, more ruthless game. "Why are you telling me all this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Nathaniel turned his full attention to her. His dark eyes were intense, searching. "Because Finch's arrival changes things. Kane knows you are here. He will use you. He will paint you as my conspirator, perhaps my lover. He will fabricate stories to discredit me, to make me seem unstable, dangerous. Your presence here is now a weapon he will try to turn against me." He paused, letting the cold reality sink in. "You have a choice. I can have Gus escort you to Sanctuary in the morning. I will give you enough money to start a new life, to go anywhere you wish. East, back to Philadelphia. Kane's fight is not yours." The offer was a lifeline, a clean escape. She could be on a stagecoach heading east by the end of the week, leaving the dust and the danger and the infuriating, compelling man beside her far behind. She could go back to a world where justice was debated in courtrooms, not stared down at the end of a rifle. She looked down at the ranch below, at the small adobe schoolhouse, at the children she had just begun to teach, at the impossible green that Nathaniel had guarded for so long. She thought of Kane's cold, dead eyes and the casual cruelty with which he had discarded an entire town, an entire community, as if it were trash. She thought of Nathaniel's books, his quiet intelligence, and the startling, unasked-for kindness that had saved her life. To run now would be to validate everything he had said about her, that her Eastern ideals were a luxury, that her principles were nothing but empty words when faced with real evil. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was as firm as the rock beneath her feet. She met his gaze without flinching. "I am a teacher, Mr. Blackwood, and the most important lesson I can teach those children down there is that you do not run from bullies. My fight, it seems, followed me here, so I will see it through." For a long moment, Nathaniel just looked at her. The wind on the mesa whipped a strand of hair across her face, but she didn't move. Then, for the very first time, he smiled. It was not the mirthless twitch she had seen before, but a genuine, startlingly warm smile that transformed his harsh features, that lit his dark eyes. "Very well, Miss Reed," he said, the respect in his voice clear and deep. "It seems your education has some value after all." Gus, who had been listening silently, grinned a wide, tobacco-stained grin. "Gonna be a hell of a lesson." As they stood on the ledge, the battle lines were no longer just on a map of the territory. They were drawn right there on that rocky outcrop between a man who had mastered the land and a woman who refused to abandon her convictions. And below them, the water of Coyote Springs flowed on, oblivious to the fact that it had become the prize in a war for the very soul of the West. The attack came not with a thunder of hooves and a chorus of war cries, but with the subtlety of a snake in the grass. It was a week later, during the hottest part of the day, when the ranch had settled into a drowsy, peaceful rhythm. A lone rider approached, waving a white cloth. He was a man Evelyn didn't recognize, gaunt and nervous, who claimed to be a surveyor from the territorial office. Nathaniel met him on the porch, flanked by Gus and two other men, their rifles held ready but not aimed. The surveyor unrolled a map, explaining with a shaky voice that he was there to officially chart the water sources in the valley for a government report on regional development. "Your report is mistaken," Nathaniel said, his voice dangerously calm. "This is private land. You have no jurisdiction here." "It's about progress, Mr. Blackwood," the man stammered, sweating profusely under the sun. "Mr. Kane," He's a civic leader. He's petitioned the government. While he spoke, Evelyn, watching from the doorway of the main house, noticed something else. Something terrifying. Two small groups of riders, maybe 5 or 6 men in each, were using the surveyor's distraction to move along the low ridges on either side of the valley. They were moving quietly, trying to flank the main house and get to the canyon where the mainspring emerged. It was Kane's plan, executed with cold military precision. A distraction at the front door while his real force moved to seize the prize. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She couldn't shout. It would give away that she'd seen them, and the shooting would start immediately. She had to get a message to Nathaniel, and she had to do it fast. Thinking quickly, she backed into the house and ran to the small schoolroom. She grabbed the slate blackboard, the one Gus had found for her. With a piece of chalk, her hand flying, she wrote 3 words in large, clear letters. Riders on ridges. She raced back to the doorway, holding the slate up where it could be seen. Nathaniel was still facing the surveyor, his back to her. But Gus was standing slightly to his side. His sharp old eyes were constantly scanning, and they flickered towards the house for just a fraction of a second. He saw the slate. His expression didn't change, but Evelyn saw a subtle shift in his stance, a slight tightening of his grip on his rifle. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod in her direction before turning his gaze back to the ridges, his eyes narrowing. A moment later, he murmured something to Nathaniel, too low for the surveyor to hear. Nathaniel didn't turn. He didn't betray the new information in any way. He simply continued his conversation with the surveyor, his voice becoming even more measured, drawing out the confrontation, buying time. Progress is a matter of perspective, he said slowly. Some see progress as a dam. I see it as honoring the land that provides. While he spoke, Gus and the other 2 hands subtly began to melt back, taking up defensive positions behind a water trough in the corner of the barn. Other ranch hands, alerted by some prearranged signal Evelyn couldn't discern, began to emerge from the bunkhouse and other buildings, rifles in hand. They moved with a quiet purpose that spoke of long preparation for this very day. The surveyor finally seemed to realize his ruse was failing. He saw the men repositioning, the quiet tension that now crackled in the air. Panic flashed in his eyes. I'll just come back another time, he said, fumbling with his map. I don't think so, Nathaniel said, and with a sudden, swift movement, he grabbed the man's bridle, pulling the horse to a sharp halt. That's when the first shot rang out. It came from the eastern ridge. One of Kane's men had gotten impatient. The bullet splintered the porch railing near where Nathaniel stood. The phony surveyor yelped, spurred his horse, and galloped away in a frenzy of terror. The fight was on. The next few hours were a terrifying, deafening blur of noise and fear. The ranch hands were outnumbered, but they had the advantage of cover and a deep knowledge of the terrain. Kane's men were exposed on the rocky ridges, forced to fire from a distance. The air filled with the constant crack of rifles and the vicious whine of ricocheting bullets. Evelyn herded the frightened children into the main house's cellar, a cool, dark space that smelled of earth and potatoes. She tried to keep them calm by telling them a story, but her voice was shaky, and she kept flinching at the sound of gunfire overhead. This was the brutal reality Nathaniel had spoken of. This was the West's true curriculum. After settling the children, she knew she couldn't just hide. She crept back upstairs. The main room of the house had been turned into a command post and an infirmary. Nathaniel was directing his men with hand signals from one window, while Gus laid down covering fire from another. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Frank, had been hit in the shoulder. Evelyn immediately went to him, tearing strips from a clean sheet to make a bandage, her hands moving with a purpose born of pure adrenaline. The standoff dragged on. Kane's men were pinned down, unable to advance to the spring or to the main house. But Nathaniel's men couldn't drive them off either. It was a stalemate. And Evelyn knew that Kane, a patient and methodical man, would be content to wait them out, to lay siege to the ranch until they ran out of ammunition or nerve. She looked at Nathaniel. He was focused, his face a mask of concentration. But she could see the strain in his eyes. He was fighting for his home, for his legacy, for his very life. An idea, desperate and half-formed, began to surface in her mind. It was a wild gamble, something from a book, not from life. Mr. Blackwood, she said, her voice tight. He glanced at her, his eyes dark with the intensity of the fight. "Stay down, Miss Reed." "The northern edge of your property," she said, speaking quickly, the words tumbling out. "You said there were two smaller springs there. What of them?" he asked, his attention still mostly on the battle outside. "Are they close to the mesas? Are there any cattle pastured near there?" He looked at her then, giving her his full attention, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "Yes, a small herd grazes in the north pasture. Why?" "Kane's men are focused here, on the main spring. They believe it's the only prize," she explained, the idea taking shape as she spoke. "But their horses will need water eventually, and they're exposed on those ridges. What if there was a diversion? A big one. Something to draw some of them away, to split their forces." "A stampede?" Gus grunted from his window, having overheard. Nathaniel stared at her, his mind working quickly, seeing the shape of her strategy. "It's too risky. It would take men to start it. Men we can't spare." "Not men," Evelyn said, her voice gaining confidence. "The rocks, the geology books in your library. I was reading one. They talk about rock slides in these mesas, how the shale is unstable, especially after the spring rains we had last month. If someone could get to the north ridge above the pasture, they might not need dynamite, just levers, crowbars. A few men could start a slide. The noise, the dust, it would be enough to spook the herd and send them running right towards the eastern ridge, where most of Kane's men are." There was a moment of stunned silence. Nathaniel and Gus both looked at her as if they were seeing her for the first time. She wasn't just a school teacher quoting books. She had taken abstract knowledge and forged it into a practical, deadly weapon. Nathaniel made his decision in an instant. "Gus, take Thomas and Miguel. Go out the back way and circle around through the low canyons. You know the spot she's talking about." Gus grinned, a fierce, wolfish expression. "Yes, ma'am. Teacher," he said with a nod to Evelyn. "Class is in session." The three men slipped out the back of the house like ghosts. What followed was the longest hour of Evelyn's life. The shooting continued, sporadic and tense. Then a low rumble started, a sound that she felt in her teeth more than she heard with her ears. It grew steadily, from a rumble to a roar, the sound of a mountain tearing itself apart. A massive cloud of dust billowed up from behind the northern mesa. Seconds later, the panicked bellowing of cattle echoed across the valley. The stampede had begun. From the window, she saw the effect immediately. The men on the eastern ridge, their position now directly in the path of 100 stampeding steers, broke formation. Their disciplined siege dissolved into pure chaos as they scrambled for their horses, trying to escape the oncoming tide of hooves and horns. This was the moment Nathaniel had been waiting for. "Now!" he yelled. He and his remaining men laid down a volley of concentrated fire, not at the fleeing men, but at their horses, pinning them down further, adding to the panic. The fight had turned. Kane's force was fractured, panicked, and caught between a rock slide and a rifle line. Within minutes, they were in full retreat, dragging their wounded, a disorganized rabble fleeing the valley. As a profound silence fell over the ranch, broken only by the panting of the men and the distant, confused lowing of the scattered herd, Evelyn leaned against the wall, her body trembling with spent adrenaline. Nathaniel walked over to her, his rifle hanging loosely in his hand. His face was grimed with dust and gunpowder, but his eyes were clear. He stood before her for a long moment, not saying a word. Then he reached out and gently took the chalk-stained slate from the table where she'd left it. He looked at the words she had written. "Riders on ridges." Then he looked back at her. "Your lesson," he said, his voice low and filled with a respect she had never heard before, "was well learned." The aftermath of the fight was a landscape of quiet industry in weary relief. Kane's men were routed, the wounded were tended to, and a deep, bone-tired peace settled over the ranch. That evening, as the sun set, Evelyn sat on the porch steps, watching the sky turn to bruised purple and orange. Nathaniel came and sat beside her, not as a host or a rescuer, but as an equal. "They won't be back," he said with quiet certainty. Kane thought he was fighting one man. He discovered today he was fighting a community. He looked at her, his expression reflective in the fading light. For years, I believed I had to keep the world out to protect this place. I saw your ideals as a weakness, an Eastern luxury this land couldn't afford. He paused, his gaze intense in the twilight. I was wrong. Today, your knowledge was a weapon. Your education saved this place, not with a rifle, but with a piece of chalk. A community that only knows how to survive isn't truly living. It needs a soul. It needs a teacher. A profound sense of belonging washed over Evelyn, so powerful it almost brought tears to her eyes. The dream she thought had died in Redemption Gulch hadn't been destroyed. It had merely been too small. I'm sending a rider to the territorial capital tomorrow, Nathaniel continued, his voice now filled with a new purpose, with a proposal to formally establish a township here. We'll call it Coyote Springs. We'll build a proper school, a church, a general store. We'll build something that lasts for generations. But a town needs more than just a founder. It will need your guidance. Evelyn looked out at the vast, starry sky stretching over the valley. She hadn't found the sanctuary she was looking for. She realized now that she was going to help build it. I believe, she said, a real smile finally reaching her eyes. That is a lesson I would be honored to teach. On the horizon, a new day was waiting to be born, and for the first time they would face it together. The story of Evelyn Reed and Nathaniel Blackwood is more than just a tale of survival in the Old West. It's a powerful reminder that true strength isn't just about wielding a gun or taming the wilderness. It's about resilience in the face of injustice, the courage to hold on to one's ideals when all seems lost, and the wisdom to see that knowledge and compassion can be the most formidable weapons of all. Their journey shows us that sometimes the home we are searching for isn't a place on a map, but a community we build with our own hands, founded on mutual respect and a shared vision for a better future. If this story of hardship, unlikely alliance, and the birth of a new beginning moved you, please help us share more tales like it. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a story with heart and grit, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to keep the spirit of these epic stories alive. Thank you for listening.